Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first installment of this year's annual New Lines Institute for Strategy and Policies conference on the Captagon drug trade. My name is Caroline Rose, and I am the director of the New Lines Institute Strategic Blind Spots portfolio and the special project on the Captagon trade. First, I want to thank both our in-person attendees and those joining us online for taking time out of their day to be with us for what is no doubt a very timely discussion about the United States strategy on the Captagon drug trade in the Middle East and beyond. This discussion will be on the record with a recorded clip uploaded to New Lines Institute's webpage shortly after today, and the audience members will be allowed to post questions in the last 10 to 15 minutes around 1 o'clock. So after the passage of the Captagon Act late last year, the United States is assembling an interagency strategy to constrict and constrain the illicit trade of the amphetamine-type stimulant Captagon, particularly as it relates to Syrian-aligned actors operating in the region and using this trade as a primary alternative revenue stream. As the United States has built momentum for this strategy, it has worked with its partners abroad, such as the United Kingdom and the EU, to impose sanctions on individual traffickers and entities in Syria and Lebanon, while exploring new pathways to promote accountability with the regime-aligned actors and mitigate the trade's harm in the region. But while all of this has happened, regional actors have pursued normalization with the Syrian regime and have even proposed direct cooperation over counter-narcotics policy. This is a new crossroads for the United States, and the real question is, how can the United States pursue a comprehensive counter-Captagon strategy within this new geopolitical reality, addressing supply, demand, and accountability for those behind the trade? Today, it is an absolute honor to be joined by Deputy Assistant Secretary Ethan A. Goldrich, Dr. Karam Shar, and Mr. Matthew Zweig for this timely discussion. I want to briefly touch upon their accomplishments and backgrounds before diving into questions and opening remarks from the Deputy Assistant Secretary. First, we have Deputy Assistant Secretary Goldrich. On September 20th, 2021, Ethan A. Goldrich began his service as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs with responsibility for the Levant and Syria engagement. We also have Dr. Karam Shar, a senior non-resident fellow at the New Lines Institute, focusing on illicit narcotic flows and their nexus with security and political systems in the Middle East, particularly in Lebanon and Syria. In addition to his work at New Lines, Dr. Shar is also a consultant on Syria's political economy and an establishing partner at the Observatory of Political and Economic Networks. And finally, last but not least, we have Mr. Matthew Zweig, Senior Director of Policy at FDD Action. From July 2019 to December 2020, Mr. Zweig served as the Senior Sanctions Advisor in the Office of the Special Representative for Syria Engagement. Now, before I dive into the questions that I have lined up, I do want to ask the Deputy Assistant Secretary for a few minutes of opening remarks on how the State Department and the United States has been dealing with the Captagon trade as it has expanded in the Middle East.
Okay, thank you very much, Caroline, and good afternoon, everybody. Really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today on an increasingly important topic. Also want to thank the New Lines Institute for organizing today's event, and really honored to share the floor with the two other distinguished panelists and to have a chance to share with you the U.S. government's approach to addressing Captagon trafficking. Captagon trafficking represents a significant threat to stability, security, and public health in the Middle East and North Africa. Individuals and entities linked to the Assad regime in Syria continue to produce and traffic large quantities of Captagon to countries throughout the region. Although Captagon is not produced in or widely available in the United States, we remain concerned about the impact of Captagon on the health, economy, and social welfare of communities in the Middle East, especially in Jordan, Lebanon, and in the Gulf. The Captagon trafficking network operates across 17 countries, ranging from Italy to Malaysia, including the entire supply chain from precursor chemicals to end-user distribution. The actors involved include elements of the Assad regime, such as Maher Assad's 4th Armored Division, as well as local tribes and individuals who are linked to Hezbollah. We're alarmed by the billions that the Assad regime and others are making off of this illicit trade. The administration is working across multiple departments and agencies to combat Captagon trafficking through 4 broad lines of effort. The first one is providing support to ongoing law enforcement investigations. Second, using economic sanctions and other financial tools to target the Assad regime-affiliated trafficking networks. Third, providing assistance and training to partner countries and cooperating within multilateral institutions to build counter-narcotics capability and to disrupt the illicit synthetic drug supply chain. And fourth, using diplomatic engagements and public messaging to exert pressure on the Assad regime to cease its drug production and trafficking. Our law enforcement agencies are already working to map out the Captagon trade's key actors, distribution networks, and financial flows as part of the law enforcement investigations in the Middle East. And we're also working with our regional partners to bolster their law enforcement cooperation and information sharing. Our sanctions are an effective tool to target the Assad regime and Hezbollah affiliates, including those involved in the Captagon trade. I think you all saw that on March 28th, the United States, in coordination with the United Kingdom, sanctioned several individuals and 2 associated entities that were involved in Captagon production and trafficking. These included Caesar Act designations of Bashar al-Assad's cousin Samar Assad and Maher's close associate Khalid Kaddour, who play key roles in Captagon production in Syria. We believe continued coordination on sanctions with our partners will help prevent elements of the Assad regime and designated terrorist organizations from using the U.S. and international financial systems to launder drug proceeds. The United States is particularly focused on helping Jordan and Lebanon combat Captagon and other drug trafficking. In Jordan, the United States is helping the Jordanian armed forces strengthen their border security, while also assisting Jordan's Public Security Directorate to reduce the impact of illegal narcotics. In Lebanon, the Department of State's International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Bureau and Near Eastern Affairs Bureau are providing short-term assistance to the Lebanese armed forces and internal security forces to ensure they are able to continue operating and to counter security threats, including those posed by drug trafficking. The State Department's Bureau of International Narcotics and Law Enforcement is also developing drug demand reduction programs in relevant countries to integrate substance abuse prevention, treatment, and recovery with supply reduction measures. Furthermore, INL funds a number of programs through multilateral organizations like the UN Office of Drugs and Crime, Colombo Plan, and international bodies like the International Narcotics Control Board to share best practices and to offer technical assistance. For example, INL has funded the UN Toolkit on synthetic drugs to provide practical guidance on topics such as preventing chemicals diversion and partnering with chemicals manufacturers, shipping companies, and financial networks to combat synthetic drug trafficking. And finally, we are coordinating with our UK, European, and regional partners, as well as the Office of the UN Special Envoy for Syria, to press the Assad regime to curtail Captagon production and smuggling as part of our broader efforts to advance regional security and political solution to the Syrian conflict in line with Security Council Resolution 2254. At the same time, we remain committed to promoting accountability for the Assad regime's abuses, and we continue to highlight the regime's complicity in human rights abuses, chemical weapons attacks, and efforts to impede humanitarian assistance. Thank you, and look forward to the questions and to hearing what my fellow panelists have to say.
Thank you so much, Deputy Assistant Secretary. You touched a bit on this regarding progress that's been made with the Counter-Captagon strategy. But the U.S. Department of State, they're approaching the 180-day deadline that has been put forth by the Captagon Act. And the Department of State is expected to soon inform the United States Congress of the progress that has been made. You mentioned the 4 different steps and lines of efforts. Can you outline some of these steps with the strategy and what we can expect within the next few weeks, and also the primary objectives of this Counter-Captagon strategy?
Yeah, so I think we'll be coming out with our strategy in the coming weeks. Tried to touch on the key points in the prepared remarks in that we have both coordination with our allies and partners, and then 4 existing lines of effort. Law enforcement, building up the capacities, including of the regional states, and using our diplomatic engagement, and also using sanctions. So we came out in March with a set of sanctions, and will continue to stay in coordination with other countries, EU, UK, and look for additional sanctions targets as they come up. We don't preview our targets. That's a long-standing policy, but this is a valuable tool that we have to ensure accountability, including on Captagon and stopping the trafficking.
Excellent. Now, the Counter-Captagon strategy was first established just a few months ago, but of course the big elephant in the room and the big question that many are wondering about is ongoing normalization efforts, and normalization's efforts use and utilization of the Captagon trade as a top agenda item. We've seen in multilateral formats Captagon come up, and collaboration over interdiction and counter-narcotics come up amongst countries that are pursuing this. I want to turn to Dr. Shar. Do you believe that the Assad regime has the capacity and the willpower to reduce the flow of Captagon in the region and scale down regime-aligned production amidst all of these rumors and reports of potential direct collaboration between the regime and regional counterparts?
So I think maybe before talking about their capacity and willpower to curb the supply of narcotics, we need to first establish their role in this supply chain. If you look at seizures data and break them by country of origin, it's immediately clear that the main supplier of Captagon to Gulf states is indeed the Syrian regime. Over 70% of those shipments originate from regime-held areas. If you include neighboring Lebanon and Lebanese actors in Syria, that share becomes 85%. So that's how significant their role is. Now, I think it's great that you're distinguishing between capacity and willpower. I think the Assad regime has the capacity to curb the supply of narcotics. It's not going to be immediate. It'll take time. I think the regime is violent enough to actually curb the flow of narcotics. But the question is whether there is will to do that. I highly doubt that they have the willpower to do it, no matter how incentivized they are. Bashar al-Assad by nature is extremely maximalist, so what you would expect him to ask in return for curbing that supply would be a whole list of demands that no one can actually meet. Now, what I think will end up happening is he will be given some initial steps towards normalization, and he would be offering counter steps in exchange. But ultimately, I think he'll be playing with Gulf states, acting as if he's going to curb that supply, but arresting a few people, releasing them later on, and so on and so forth. The same way he was playing with the US government following the invasion of Iraq, for example, and how he was promising to curb the flow of fighters into neighboring Iraq. So I think that's the most likely scenario as of now.
Absolutely. So there definitely is this chance and potential for data manipulation, cosmetic seizures, and this continued narrative essentially denying production in regime-held areas. This is only a transit and trafficking country, but not necessarily a site for production. And that definitely could be used as a card. That brings me to my next question, Mr. Zweig. What tools now does the United States have in its pocket moving forward? Thinking both within the U.S. established Counter-Captagon policy and strategy, but then also beyond. How can the United States, wield these tools against networks like regime-aligned networks, Hezbollah, and Iran-aligned militias? I know you've looked into recent flows into Israel, Jordan, and other transit countries. And with that in mind, is there room for additional border security cooperation and assistance programs with partners? What other tools does the United States have?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think the United States, to what Ethan said earlier about kind of leveraging both law enforcement, sanctions, and and other tools, and on the law enforcement side, I think there's a considerable body of law and investigative capacity in terms of investigating international narcotics and investigating and ultimately prosecuting international narcotics networks and transnational criminal organizations. I absolutely think there is room for security-related, an increase in security-related assistance. You have Department of Defense programs, you have Department of State programs that provide building partnership capacity to various regional states. You've seen, the border security element associated with Captagon elevated, right, over the last few years in terms of importance when it comes to that. So I think that's kind of an important an important trajectory to maintain. There are a couple of other areas that may warrant exploration. Overlaid with respect to anti-narcotics trade is money laundering, right? Not just sanctions evasion, but money laundering. So begin to look deeper into the money laundering aspect of the Captagon trade, better identify Captagon-specific typologies, in addition to actors that you can then better disseminate to financial intelligence units throughout the region, to regional banks, and regional financial institutions, which obviously are much more prolific than banks sometimes. And that's one aspect to do it. You could do it either through in a bilateral context or through the Middle East, through the Middle East and North Africa Financial Action Task Force, or through the Financial Action Task Force back in Paris. Well, probably not the latter. Probably more likely the former. Another associated with these major, another kind of typology, maybe another area to look into is, the issue of trade-based money laundering. That's one of the best ways to move value throughout in the Western Hemisphere, in the Middle East, et cetera. The administration may want to look into mechanisms like trade transparency units, in which have had which I generally think are a good concept that continually need to be honed, but that have had that the United States has had considerable experience with here in the Western Hemisphere.
Absolutely. And that brings me a bit to some of the efforts and the collaborative efforts that the United States has thus far wielded in its efforts against the Captagon trade. And I want to follow up with Deputy Assistant Secretary Goldrich. The United States and the UK, same day, March 28th, imposed designations of sanctions on a number of Syrian and Lebanese Captagon producers and traffickers. This was a notable step to keep the regime and also Hezbollah agents of Captagon accountable. Can you speak a bit about how these sanctions related to United States objectives through the Counter-Captagon strategy? They also coincided with normalization efforts and the momentum of discussions amongst U.S. partners and regional actors with the Syrian regime. Was an intended objective of the sanction announcement? Was it intended to dissuade against normalization efforts? Was it a message that was sent to the region? And then finally, can we expect further collaboration with the United Kingdom and partners like the EU, who of course also imposed their own sanctions package just a few weeks later?
We have, thank God, great collaboration with the UK and the EU on common objectives, and the Captagon sanctions that came out in March were a long-standing effort, both by us and by them, to put those sanctions together. I think we all see, the threats that Captagon poses to the region, and to wider concerns and want to stay in communication with them. We're in communication and coordination with them on larger Syria issues as well. So on the question of the normalizations, we don't support normalization. We certainly are not going to normalize ourselves. We said, at the time that Syria was being reactivated in the Arab League, that we didn't think they had earned that. We didn't think they deserved that. And now we're looking at where the different Arab states are going forward from the Arab League meeting. So we see that there's a wide spectrum of activity on the parts of the different Arab states. Some of them are normalizing, some of them are engaging but not normalizing, and some of them aren't changing position at all. In terms of engagements, we look at the statements that have come out of Amman meeting and the Jeddah meeting, and we see that some of their objectives coming out of these meetings overlap with some of our objectives. So in that case, we would look at is there anything that they can get out of their engagements that'll contribute to overlapping objectives. And they mentioned Captagon in what they're trying to do. We certainly see it as something that should be of immediate concern to regional states, and if they're engaging with the Syrian regime, it should be a top issue that they're discussing. And again, with the full skepticism that Karam expressed on what they're up against in terms of where the regime may be coming from and how it views the issue. But if they're engaging on it, then we hope that they will be able to pursue the same kinds of objectives that we're pursuing, and then just see how far they get with it.
Absolutely, and this definitely has been a top item that has been discussed in a lot of these normalization discussions. And I think we've seen a lot of different policies wielded and a number of different formats that have been proposed in terms of Counter-Captagon efforts. We've seen a few task forces established between Jordan, Iraq, and Syria, and a number of other initiatives. I want to turn to Mr. Zweig. I want to talk about the Kingpin Act, because I know the three of us, we've been traveling frequently in the last few weeks, and that has come up. That's been a very big question, is can the United States use this for accountability? And if not, what are some other policy pathways that are on the table for the United States, especially as we're looking beyond June with the Counter-Captagon strategy that has been outlined? What are ways that we can kind of build off of that with normalization in mind?
Well, I mean, with normalization in mind, just my personal opinion on this, I think they're going to find it very hard to normalize with the narco state. I think there's an embedded incentive structure now with respect to the narco trade that didn't exist before. When you look at kind of the work that you and Karam have done in terms of just quantifying the scope and the scale of the trade, I think that's an area that again its magnitudes beyond what their GDP is. So I think it's going to be very hard for them to pull away, kind of to Karam's earlier point. In terms of the Kingpin Act, I think you'd have to kind of zoom out with respect to the narco trafficking sanctions revisions that have been that were initiated under the prior administration, and this administration has done an excellent job in updating and executing. And it's relevant not just to Captagon, but to kind of the wider narco-terrorism trade, or to the wider narcotics trade. I think an overlay with respect to, narcotics, narco-related sanctions, with respect to, the Syria sanctions regime and the Syria-related sanctions regimes, and other thematic sanctions regimes is kind of an important way to go in finding kind of the best direct route to those who are enabling the trade and going after them. So that's, but again, it's not just a sanctions issue. As I mentioned earlier, it is a broader anti-money laundering issue and drawing awareness to the anti-money laundering overlays, right? Identifying methodologies and bringing awareness to that is key, and it will be critical to ultimately undermining, the efficacy of these networks, or the effectiveness of these networks.
Absolutely. Yeah, finding some, filling in the gaps of data and information regarding precursor tracking and how money is being laundered is incredibly, incredibly important.
Right, but I'd also add though that something very important that I'd want to note that the Biden administration, the State Department, the Treasury Department did with their March designations. I mean, remember, the press releases for those designations are effectively, the public evidentiaries, right? They provide public evidence for, for illicit conduct and tying, right? Illicit conduct surrounding the Captagon trade back to sanctions designations for human rights, but also for Syrian government facilitation was, it sends a pretty, I'd say, good signal in that sense.
Absolutely, and I will say that, all of those designations, when you read through them, it's not just a list of the names, and it really is a descriptive kind of summary of their activities, which is important. I want to kind of jump back and tie in the syndicates that are involved in this. Also, again, how this is relating to normalization and then moving forward in terms of border security, cooperation, and cooperative efforts. Dr. Shar, you've mapped the extensive network of Captagon smuggling syndicates and production sites. And as of yesterday, a report, a dossier at New Lines was published. You and I co-authored something on how the regime is approaching this issue and how data could be manipulated, how this could be used, their history with counter-narcotics policy could be incorporated into normalization efforts and a strategy forward. Jordan and Iraq have recently established these 2 working groups on counter-narcotics strategy and also investigating who is behind this trade. We're seeing normalization discussions elevate Captagon, potential financial packages being offered as well. Does the United States have any blind spots for its partners working directly with the Syrian regime on counter-narcotics? And how do you think the United States can mitigate that gap, knowing that the regime may likely participate in cosmetic seizures and data manipulation? How can the United States work best with these partners moving forward?
I mean, if we look at it just from the perspective of these countries before talking about the role of the US and what can be done about it, they're extremely frustrated. And for them, they believe that they've tried everything. And now the only thing they haven't tried is to actually work with the Syrian regime. And I must say, there is a serious dilemma there. You can would you work with such a regime that's incredibly corrupt, incredibly violent? However, with the right incentives, does indeed have the ability to curb much of that supply. But if you do that, then that would also mean basically killing the political process, forgetting about the return of refugees, empowering malign actors in the region, such as the Assad regime itself or Iranian-aligned militias and so on. So how do you engage with it? I think the right approach is to work with the regime only on an operational level. So say there is a seizure in Saudi Arabia, I think they should be actually sending the names of the people who sent that shipment back to Syrian authorities and asking them, what can you tell us about these 2 individuals? I think it's helpful, when they receive such answers, it's helpful whether the Syrian regime gives the right answer or the wrong answer. It's still informative because you want to know how they interact with the sector. What's the relationship between the regime and the sector? However, that should not be done at the expense of the political process or giving any concessions that actually empower the regime. Just because of what I mentioned earlier, which is the fact that I don't believe the regime will curb that industry genuinely. They have no interest in doing it. So now back to your question about these groups and between Jordan and Syria on one side, and then Jordan and Syria on one side, and then Iraq and Syria on the other side. I think they're useful. Just to understand how the regime interacts with the sector, but nothing beyond that. Now, if we now take a step back and think about the big picture, how do we address this ensuing crisis? And when I'm saying crisis, it's a crisis indeed, because you're talking about over 1 billion pills seized in the past 3 years. So it's a serious problem that many countries in the region do see it as such. The way to address it is to address the root causes. Let's assume there is a world where Bashar al-Assad says, I'm willing to curb the supply of Captagon from my areas, but what would happen to other producers? That actually creates incentive for other producers in other parts of the region, such as Lebanon, or in fact, opposition-held areas where they currently produce trivial, like small amounts. If there is a settlement with the regime without an overall political settlement in the region, these guys would be producing instead of the Assad regime. So I think the way we need to be dealing with this crisis is to appreciate that this is going to take so much time, and that the strategy towards it needs to be holistic. You need to focus on awareness raising, lowering demand, and on the supply side, it requires intelligence sharing. It requires providing people with alternative livelihoods to be able to avoid working on narcotics. Rule of law, basically, which happens only with institutions that actually function, and for Syria, currently these institutions do not work. Now I think we can think of the role that the US can play. I don't see a world where sanctions could have any meaningful impact on the crisis. These are just, those would be just to signal to those actors that, hey, we don't like you. But that doesn't prevent them from producing or even channeling their funds or moving the money. They're pretty skilled at moving the money around. I think the only way the US can actually have a positive impact is to get consumer countries on board with their strategy. Even developing an interagency strategy that does not include these countries, doesn't include Saudi Arabia and the UAE, you wonder what the impact would be, because there's no Captagon in the US. The issue is in Jordan, in Saudi Arabia, in the UAE. So I think the top priority should be to work with these countries and make sure that the response is coordinated among all of them.
Absolutely. And I think that, in our years of studying Captagon and all its different elements, communication over drug trades like Captagon is incredibly important. Intelligence sharing, tip-offs, whatever really we can exchange with partners on the ground. I want to get to my last question, which is my favorite question. And it's really the future of all of this and the next necessary steps. If you could summarize, all of you, what are the next pathways that the United States could take or should take in a U.S. Counter-Captagon strategy? Will the U.S. seek to work with partners in the EU, in the UK, and also in the region to counter the trade? And if so, how should or will it seek to collaborate? And I want to start off with Deputy Assistant Secretary Goldfinch.
Okay. So for us, the very next step, we'll, as Congress has asked for a report, and we'll be delivering our report, and we'll be following through on the different lines of effort that I described. I think the cooperation with like-minded states and regional states is key. That we'll be staying in touch with them, and also the interagency coordination within our own government. That preparing the report was a helpful exercise in having us all comparing notes regularly on where we're going with our different lines of effort, and then we'll continue moving forward. And as you pointed out, there are changing regional circumstances, and factoring in how to make the best use of that as well. But with the goal again of doing our best to try to stop the production and stop the trade, and try to do away with something that is a threat to the societies in the region.
Absolutely. Dr. Shah?
I would say, or maybe just reiterate the significance of coordination between like-minded countries and working with them to come up with a joint strategy to address the crisis. But I also think there is room for implementing operational policies that can be quite useful, so not necessarily something huge, but for instance, one of the thoughts that came up in our previous engagements was to establish a lab for analyzing Captagon seizures, for instance. So what chemicals are actually included in them? Can we use that to work like backwards and try to identify where those actually came from? So there are, I think, also some like small steps, small gains and low-hanging fruit that we can focus on.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and to that point, I mean, I think you touched on an important point with respect to broader information sharing within the region, right, and effective information sharing and real-time information sharing on typologies, on lab results, on just kind of general, just kind of the general ebb and flow of kind of the organized crime syndicates that are involved in this. I think that's going to be an incredibly important component of this going forward. I mean, in my mind, number one, I think the Captagon Act also mandated kind of a multilateral exercise as well on part of the on the part of the administration. So you kind of have that aspect working there, and both with respect to regional states. But I mean, finally, I mean, in my mind, it's a matter of judicial finishes. Yeah. Working with allies to ensure, sanctions are important tools. Sanctions are an important limiting tool, but ultimately, extraditions and prosecutions are going to kind of be key to developing a, let's just say, a deterrent with respect to the trade.
Absolutely. All right, well, we actually have a few extra minutes, and we're moving on to audience questions a bit early. I do want to quickly just make a quick note on the laboratory element as well. It seems that this is an interesting solution that could be not only for accountability and identifying actors and the networks involved, but then on the other side, identifying just what is inside Captagon. Because right now there's a big question about, what is Captagon, what are the components inside, the cutting agents, and how is that affecting different public health sectors. And so I think that's a very interesting proposal and something that should be definitely explored. I want to open it up to the audience. Are there any questions that we have for participants?
Deputy Secretary, thank you very much for taking time from your busy schedule. There is the memo on presidential determination on major drug transit or major illicit drug producing countries. Comes out every year. President of the United States signs it. It lists all of the illicit drug producing countries. Syria has never been on the list. We say Captagon is a major threat. It probably brings in about $6 billion to the Assad regime, and yet consistently it has never been listed among the bad boys and the usual bad actors, of course. So do you care to comment on that?
That is actually something I would have to check with my colleagues in the International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Bureau. We're probably in the lead on that, and on what the criteria is for how the list is put together. But I will definitely take that one on board and ask what.
It includes the usuals: Afghanistan, Venezuela, all of the bad actors, and it seems to be quite strange that Syria is never included, including 2023, when we're saying Captagon is a major threat. So.
Yeah, so clearly we appreciate the threat. So it's that particular document that I would need to find out, what it is that goes into putting country onto the list, or and follow up. You gave me your card. I might even track you down and continue the discussion.
Question for Matt and Karam. As we know, back in February, in response to the earthquakes, the United States issued a lifting, as it were, of certain Caesar sanctions regarding providing humanitarian assistance in response to the massive damage in the Northwest. My question is that has there been any evidence that you guys have found in your research to indicate, and perhaps Secretary Goldberg, you can address this as well, in terms of oversight where the Assad regime and its affiliates have utilized this waiver, to elicit or through basically funnel Captagon funding through foreign accounts into its coffers under the guise of providing earthquake relief.
I mean, I think a lot of that has to do with kind of the trade, you know, I don't have kind of the updated trade data, and I think that's one of the things that you have to look at is, you know, are there certain anomalies with, you know, that are identified within trade data that would be indicative of, you know, of major movement of value, number one. I mean, I think the other concern with respect to General License 23 is also on the precursor flows as well, and taking advantage of General License 23 to either modify or to enhance kind of the precursor networks. I mean, I think there are kind of two questions there, but again, you'd really have to, you know, it's still kind of early to look at the trade data, at least from where I sit and from, you know, the very limited very limited data I have available to me. I don't know, Karim, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I'm definitely in favor of GL23. I think it came at the right time. I think it helped facilitate the humanitarian response to the earthquake. Whether that has been abused by the regime, I don't know. But I just want to highlight something. I think we tend to overstate the usefulness of targeting Syria's banking sector and how it can hurt the Syrian regime. I think it hurts more civilians than the regime, to be honest. I think the regime and its criminal networks are the ones that have the means to circumvent these sanctions. It's ordinary people who don't have those means to circumvent them. So if you're a YouTuber based in Damascus and you provide educational videos or cooking videos, you can't receive a payment because of those sanctions. But it's actually regime cronies who know how to circumvent them. It results in a premium on their transaction costs, but it never actually prevents them from moving this money around.
I'm not sure if you...
From our perspective, the general license was meant to make sure that humanitarian assistance could get through to the earthquake victims. We had already built our sanctions in a way that they shouldn't have been getting in the way of humanitarian assistance, but there were private individuals and governments that were concerned that, you know, under the existing structure, they were still worried, so that we issued the general license to make it even clearer that they should feel comfortable getting assistance through. And then the Treasury Department watches carefully for abuse to make sure that there's not abuse of the general license. So whether that's, you know, 100% airtight or whatever, but they're watching carefully, and we have the capacity to shut down the general license if there's, you know, significant abuse of the general license. Intrigued by Karam's observations about the effectiveness of the sanctions, but what I can say is that, you know, our sanctions are going to remain in place, you know, even as countries have begun engaging or normalizing or whatever. We're reminding everybody that our sanctions are in place, and the whatever kind of engagement or normalization activity they're in, they need to be careful and understand how our sanctions work and avoid going cross ways with our sanctions. And that's certainly another important aspect to what we're doing and saying at the moment, so there are no misunderstandings about what is or isn't appropriate in the engagements that they're having. If it's something that violates a U.S. sanction, the U.S. sanctions are there. And
Excellent. I know you have a two-finger. I'm going to have another question, and then you can incorporate that two-finger into your response so that way we can stay on time. Does that work? Yes, Dora.
Thank you very much. My question would be, in light of the normalization efforts, but also this extreme concerns from the regional countries on the Captagon trade, how would you assess the Jordanian airstrike in southern Syria, basically at the same time as reintegration of Syria and the Arab League was happening? Thank you.
Excellent. If everyone would like to make a comment, if possible, if not, no worries.
Do
We
you
can
wanna-
go this way this time.
This way?
Yes.
I mean, we've gone, I think it's a sea change, but, look, I can't remember a time where a narco trade, at least in the region in the last 20, 25 years, where a narco trade of this scale has gone kinetic. I mean, I think that's an incredibly kind of important departure point. And where it goes from there, I'm not entirely sure. I mean, that's just kind of be my quick answer.
Yeah, I mean, I think the killing of Mir'i Ramthan in southern Syria is notable, and the way I see it, it has been done in cahoots with the Syrian regime. They've been coordinating this. It's not an isolated action. And in fact, there has been reports that it wasn't even Jordan that did the strike. It's actually the regime itself that did it. And there are so many speculations about what actually happened, with some people saying that the whole family died in that attack, while others are arguing no, it's actually only Mir'i Ramthan who has been killed. So I'm not sure like exactly what happened, but my feeling is that it's been done in coordination with the regime. The regime didn't issue any statement or any public response to what happened after the event. But I just wanted to comment on sanctions so that it's not misunderstood, since it's such a contentious topic. I always say the easiest way to lose friends is to talk about religion and sanctions. So, I mean, that's...
Now we know what to talk about at the dinner table.
Let's not talk about religion here. So, but actually, I feel...
I thought you said it was rugby.
So sanctions are necessary but insufficient. Their impact is limited. When those listings are announced on producers of narcotics, I think that's a positive step, but its impact is very, very limited. So I think there is a world where sanctions, after they're reformed, they can actually hurt the regime a lot more and hurt civilians a lot less. And I think we ought to be asking these questions. I appreciate this is not a session about sanctions, but I just wanted to be clear. I'm not against sanctions, but I believe we need to reform the current setting.
Thank you. And this isn't necessarily a session about sanctions exactly, but as of March, sanctions definitely play into the conversation on Captagon, especially after the recent designations from the United States, the UK, and the EU. And great question. I think that it's very interesting as well in terms of normalization and the strike that came just a few days after the dialogue that we saw in Amman. And, that definitely was an interesting kind of coincidence. And the strike came right after we saw those working groups established. So I'll take another audience question. I know you also had a two-finger, and we can incorporate that into the next response. Is there another question from the audience? Yes.
Oh, no, she asked a question.
Oh, okay, good. Yes, Calvin.
So I was also curious about the Jordanian airstrike, but I was curious, I guess, more generally about the variation in Arab states' response to the Captagon crisis. Are you seeing, from you guys' perspective, are all these states kind of marching to the beat of the same drum, or is there some variation in terms of how they evaluate the problem and what solutions they see as being plausible? And thank you all for being here. This has been really informative.
Perhaps we can start with Deputy Assistant Secretary and then move down.
So I think, clearly there's a lot of concern in the region. They regard it as a threat to their societies, and they've highlighted it as one of the reasons why they felt that they had to engage with the regime. So I think, probably there is variation in how they want to approach it or what they're going to emphasize. But it's important. It's important to states that are key partners that we have in the region. So among the different reasons why we want to address it is to ensure that we're doing what we can to help them deal with what they've defined as a threat to them.
Yeah, I mean, I do see significant variations in the way they're approaching the crisis, and it's partly because not all of them have like the same amount of skin in the game. So for Saudi Arabia, it's a top priority. Over 1 week, they arrested nearly 80 people. So, and they decided to just confront this issue head on. They've been trying to explore different alternatives, but over the past like month or 2 months, they clearly have decided to tackle this issue head on. For Jordan, for example, who did try a year and a half ago to lead like the step-for-step approach and tackle the issue of narcotics among other issues, they seem to be far less enthusiastic about it. They decided to go on board, like join other countries, primarily Saudi Arabia and the UAE, but I think they're still very reluctant. And I think they're all, in general, in for a big disappointment.
Yeah, I agree with the big disappointment. The one thing I note is, perhaps the varying law enforcement capabilities and competencies as well regionally. I mean, you always see a mix of military and law enforcement, but I mean, all too often, kind of law enforcement when it comes to building partnership capacity has been, subordinate to military, to building partnership capacity in regional militaries. And I think you're beginning to see that take a much more prominent role because of the Captagon trade in how the United States and others assess our programming. One thing I'd note, and I have to note a slight disagreement with my colleague Karam is, at least in sanctions, sometimes it's important to zoom out a little bit. You see sanctions as a subset of coercive economic measures, and based on kind of the broader continuum of coercive economic measures, right? Where you ultimately, place your focus determines where you want to push a particular act or a particular subset of actors, or subgroup of actors. So, in that case, I respectfully disagree with Karam's, analysis on it, but. And we've had this conversation a number of times as well.
It's a good debate.
Not to turn this into a sanctions debate. So
not a problem. And just to also kind of a two-finger on my end regarding the variance and normalization approaches, I think it's also interesting to look at the states that have pumped the brakes on normalization just a few months ago, and also how different their approach has been with the Captagon trade. Trying, and I think, Dr. Shah, you're absolutely right about states experimenting with what the red lights and also what the green lights with the regime are, engaging how they'll behave, what information they'll give up, what intelligence they'll offer, versus those that want a much more confrontational and a bit more of a simplistic approach. So it's very interesting to observe that variance, and I think we're seeing a huge spectrum right now, which is very interesting. We had another question.
Sorry, just to clarify, so I had understood your question on whether there are variations in their approach to Captagon. On the larger question of whether there are variations in normalization, yes, that I think I touched on that earlier, that some of them aren't even normalizing, they're just saying that they're engaging, with specific ends. Some of them aren't even engaging, they're saying that, they still don't want to deal with the regime. And then some of them are doing, what in the formal definition of normalizing, reopening embassies or sending high-level delegations or whatever. So there is a whole spectrum of how much or how little different Arab states have decided they're going to do with the regime.
Absolutely. We have one question.
Yes. So this is very new topics to me, so please forgive me if I'm asking silly questions. But the way how I see, and I think everybody else also could see, that there are two sides to this, right? There's the supply side and then there's the demand side. And clearly, a lot of things have been done to curtail the supply, right? To the extent that's possible, and there are variances. So I really like, the point about the demand side, because as long as there is demand, there will be a supply. People will figure out how to supply because there's a demand, right? So I think it's equally important to work on the demand side, as Karam pointed out, through various means, right? It may be public awareness, but one of the things that get people moving is data, numbers, right? So what are the facts about threats to the demand, the consumers of this drug. So you mentioned public health, any other negative impact or threats that the public need to be educated on. So that could be one of the multiple tools that you will need to use in addition to the sanction, which you said one of the measures, right? So I just wanted to ask about if some numbers, facts, data you have, and clearly there is a different data for the different countries that are involved in this, and this could be one of the reasons why there is a variance in the way how they, take actions, respond. So, thank you.
We'll go reverse direction this time, Mr. Swain.
I mean, I defer to Karim on the particular data, because I think your data sets are much newer, much more recent, much more accurate than those we've been dealing with for a while. I mean, on the public health standpoint, I'd actually just two things. Number one, the U.S. does have experience in demand, in developing demand reduction strategies. I mean, perhaps it might be useful for us to either draw lessons from that, both in the positive and perhaps more increasingly in the negative, in terms of what hasn't worked versus what's worked. Number one. Number two, I mean, we talk about it as a Middle East regional and Gulf issue in terms of the Captagon trade. It's more than that. I mean, perhaps broadening that conversation would be helpful in terms of sub-Saharan Africa, in terms of, popping up in various places in Europe, et cetera.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. And unfortunately, numbers on illicit activities are usually hard to come by. And in that region specifically, they're virtually non-existent. And so you have to at times use broken lenses to back out what's happening. So such as looking at seizures to work out how much is being consumed, for instance. It's a very long leap. I mean, it's difficult to work out how much is actually consumed from seizures, but yeah, it is what it is. In countries like in main consumer markets, there are no official statistics on what's happening. At least I tried, for instance, in the case of Saudi Arabia, the most recent figure I found on the overall number of drug addicts, no specific breakdown, was actually from 2018. So it's really difficult to know what's happening. And that's why we have huge knowledge gaps when it comes to this topic. And yeah, we're trying to work on filling them up in our program.
Yeah.
So that's about like the consumption, right? But what about the actual effect? Let's say, you can extrapolate once you identify the effects on an individual based on assumed amount of drug, right? So if an individual were to take certain amount of drug, this is what happens. And then you can extrapolate that based on, estimated number of consumptions.
There has been such studies in Jordan, I think, more than any other country, academic studies that looked into it. But yeah, I mean, for other countries, I don't think there are any.
Something for the future, or in the near future.
Yeah.
I'll just come back on your first question. So one of the lines of effort I mentioned is the capacity building. So certainly, the demand side is also something that we can help build capacity on in terms of sharing experience that we've had in the U.S. and resources that we use to deal with the demand side to help educate affected countries.
And I'll add too, this is, as the Captagon trade has been widely remarked in terms of the securitization of this trade, the clashes and, the actors involved. There's a lot of spotlight and attention on the security elements, but the consumption and the public health effects are, kind of this additional element that not many focus on. But it's interesting in that there definitely is a nexus, but by studying the health effects, by studying some of this consumption data, you can also find ways to identify the actors involved in the ways that Captagon is produced. So very interesting. With that, we don't have much more time, so I do want to thank everyone for making it out here, and sincerely thank our participants, Deputy Assistant Secretary Goldrich, Dr. Shar, and Mr. Zweig for taking the time out of your busy schedules to be here with us and share your expert insights. For more work, events, and analyses on the Captagon trade, please do check out the New Lines Captagon Trade Project online at newlinesinstitute.org. And to check out a recording of this discussion, you can find this on the New Lines YouTube page shortly after this discussion. Thank you so much for being here in person, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.